past 20 years, wild reindeer and caribou populations have declined by more than 2 million.
Far out in the Bering Sea, on a wind-carved island few people have ever seen, a quiet wartime decision set an entire ecosystem on a collision course with itself. What began as a simple survival measure soon grew into an unstoppable force, leaving behind a collapse so complete that its imprint settled not only across the land, but deep within the island's soil. A living pantry at the edge of the world, in the final years of World War II, when uncertainty shaped every decision in the North Pacific, the United States Coast Guard sought a way to protect the men stationed on one of the most isolated outposts in Alaska. St. Matthew Island, a narrow sweep of tundra surrounded by storm-lashed seas, offered almost nothing in the way of natural resources, which led military planners to imagine an unconventional form of insurance. In August 1944, they transported 29 reindeer to the island, believing the animals would serve as a dependable food reserve should supply routes fail during harsh winters or enemy interference. The island's untouched lichen fields appeared to promise an endless buffet, and the absence of predators made the introduction seem harmless, even efficient. What the Coast Guard could not foresee was that St. Matthew functioned as a sealed ecological chamber, where every action amplified over time. The reindeer, stepping into a landscape shaped by millennia without large herbivores, encountered conditions that encouraged rapid expansion long before anyone realized the potential consequences. As the herd settled into its new home, the stage was set for a population surge that would reshape the island far more dramatically than the military ever intended. Paradise without predators. For the first decade after their arrival, the reindeer lived in conditions so favorable that their expansion seemed almost predetermined. St. Matthew Island offered an abundance of soft, spongy lichen that had accumulated for centuries, creating a winter food source far richer than anything available on the mainland. Without wolves or bears to introduce natural limits, every calf born had a strong chance of survival, allowing the herd to increase at a pace rarely seen in large mammals. The combination of plentiful forage, protective isolation, and low-energy expenditure transformed the animals into unusually robust specimens, with researchers later noting that adult males in the 1950s were significantly heavier than their mainland counterparts. During a 1957 visit, wildlife biologist David Klein observed a herd of approximately 1,300 individuals thriving in this predator-free sanctuary. Their physical condition reflected the richness of their environment, yet subtle warnings had already begun to emerge. Klein noted early trampling patterns across the tundra, along with lichen patches worn thinner than expected in areas of concentrated grazing. Although the reindeer appeared vigorous, the island's vegetation had started absorbing the growing impact of thousands of hooves pressing into delicate tundra soils. Despite these observations, the island still looked prosperous on the surface, and the reindeer continued expanding into areas previously untouched. Their remarkable success disguised the fragile balance beneath their hooves, setting the ecological clock in motion even as the herd flourished. By the end of the 1950s, the conditions that had nurtured their growth were already beginning to shift, though few signs pointed to the far-reaching consequences that would unfold in the years ahead. When success became the threat. By the summer of 1963, St. Matthew Island held a herd so large that the landscape itself seemed unable to contain it. What began with 29 reindeer had expanded into a population of roughly 6,000, a density that forced the animals into every corner of the island in search of diminishing forage. Although the sheer number of bodies suggested prosperity, a closer look revealed an ecosystem in distress and a herd already entering physiological decline. Klein's measurements showed that the reindeer had begun shrinking in size, with shorter long bones and reduced body mass reflecting years of nutritional stress during crucial developmental periods. The island's carrying capacity, which could reasonably support only a few hundred individuals, had been exceeded by more than an order of magnitude. The reindeer had consumed not only the annual growth of lichen, but also the deeper reserves built over centuries, undermining the vegetation that anchored the island's fragile soils. trails carved by repeated movements grew deeper each season, slicing through hummocks and exposing permafrost that melted more easily under direct sunlight. The tundra's structure, once resilient and tightly woven, loosened under pressure as erosion patterns intensified. At ground level, the effects appeared in the disappearance of the lush, white lichen carpet, replaced by trampled earth and scattered grasses of lower nutritional value. Higher on the ridges, the animals ventured into rocky areas they had previously ignored, driven there by the absence of sufficient food in traditional grazing zones. Despite the scale of depletion, the herd persisted in expanding, propelled by biological momentum rather than environmental stability. Within this paradox of abundance and decline, St. Matthew Island resembled a closed system nearing its critical threshold. Its biological reserves stretched thin beneath the weight of an increasingly desperate, resource-depleted population that had no possibility of retreat. The Great Die-Off. When the winter of 1963 arrived, it carried a severity that turned scarcity into catastrophe. A sequence of storms swept across the Bering Sea, dropping heavy snow that briefly softened under short thaws before refreezing into a hardened crust. This icy layer sealed the island's already diminished forage beneath a barrier the reindeer could not break, removing even the low-quality grasses and sedges that remained after years of intensive grazing. Under normal conditions, reindeer would use their hooves to carve through snow in search of lichen, yet the frozen surface resisted every attempt, leaving thousands of animals with little more than the energy reserves stored on their bodies. Those reserves, however, had been depleted long before the first storms arrived. The herd entered winter malnourished, carrying minimal fat after several years spent competing for inadequate forage. As temperatures dropped and winds intensified, the animals faced metabolic demands they could no longer meet, forcing them into sheltered valleys where overcrowding amplified stress and hastened their decline. Klein's later analysis confirmed that marrow inside the bones of the carcasses appeared red and gelatinous, a signature of acute starvation in which the body consumes its final stores of fat and energy. By the time the storms relented, the collapse was nearly complete. When Klein returned in 1966, expecting to evaluate a still sizable herd, he encountered an island strewn with bleached skeletons and only 42 survivors wandering across the tundra. Among them, a single male exhibited stunted antlers and signs of developmental weakness, eliminating any realistic chance of the population rebuilding. The reindeer had reached a biological endpoint, their expansion giving way to a rapid crash that ended with an irreversible loss of reproductive potential across the island. The soil's hidden signature. Long after the last weakened reindeer disappeared from St. Matthew Island, scientists searching for clues to the scale of the collapse began finding evidence preserved not in bones or vegetation, but in the island's soil. Decades after Klein's surveys, researchers extracted peat cores from several sites and uncovered a chemical anomaly that corresponded precisely to the years following the die-off. Layers that should have reflected stable Arctic nutrient cycles instead showed an abrupt spike in nitrogen and carbon isotopes, followed by a sharp decline that persisted for more than a decade. This pattern revealed that the decomposition of thousands of carcasses had temporarily overloaded the tundra with nutrients before the system abruptly contracted as the remaining organic material was exhausted. The signal, visible as a distinct band within the cores, marked a moment when the island's biological upheaval became a geological event. It demonstrated that the collapse was not simply an ecological turning point, but a disruption powerful enough to alter the soil's long-term chemical record. The isotopic shift persists even today, offering a measurable imprint of the disaster that endured long after the landscape regained its quiet exterior. For researchers, this discovery provided a rare opportunity to observe how a closed system records rapid population expansion and sudden collapse, revealing the island's capacity to store the memory of its most dramatic transformations. The soil captured what the reindeer themselves could not survive, a chronicle of excess, depletion, and irreversible change that deepened scientific understanding of the long shadow left by biological overshoot. An ecosystem relearning itself. In the years that followed the collapse, St. Matthew Island began a slow and uneven process of ecological recovery. The dramatic reduction in grazing pressure allowed tundra vegetation to re-establish itself. Yet the island's signature lichen carpets, once several inches thick, showed only limited signs of return, These organisms grow at rates measured in millimeters per year, and their absence revealed how thoroughly the reindeer had consumed not just seasonal growth, but the foundational layers built across centuries. Areas once dominated by lichen gradually filled with sedges, mosses, and hardy grasses that colonized exposed soil more quickly, creating a new plant community that differed significantly from the pre-1944 landscape. Wildlife patterns also shifted as the island adjusted to its altered terrain. The insular vole population, which had declined during years of heavy trampling, slowly rebounded, providing renewed prey for the island's Arctic foxes. Seasonal visitors such as polar bears continued to arrive with winter sea ice, while millions of seabirds maintained their nesting grounds along the cliffs. Throughout these transitions, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service adopted a management approach focused on minimal intervention, allowing natural processes to unfold without reintroducing large herbivores. Despite the island's outward appearance of resilience, the echoes of the reindeer era remain embedded in its vegetation, soil, and species distribution, illustrating how deeply a brief period of imbalance can reshape an isolated ecosystem. St. Matthew Island's quiet tundra carries the memory of a rise and collapse etched into its soil, reminding us that every ecosystem holds boundaries we ignore at our peril. If this story resonates, subscribe and continue exploring the hidden histories shaping our world's past, present, and future.